Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog here on Mint Press with me, Lowkey. We weekly are going against the grain and publishing stories which are routinely ignored by the mainstream media. For that reason, we really do need as much help from you as we can get. So please, I do ask you that you join our Patreon and subscribe there to help us to continue to publish this important public interest journalism that we need in order to understand the structures of power in the world around us. Now, for this episode, we are joined this week by somebody who has enjoyed different designations across his professional career. We are talking about none other than the academic and public intellectual David Miller. Many will know that David was subjected to a horrendous campaign by the Israel lobby to force him out of Bristol University, and eventually that led to him losing his job, despite the fact that an investigation was carried out which concluded that the allegations of the Israel lobbyists were unfounded. David, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today on The Watchdog.
Thank you for having me.
Would you take issue with the definition of public intellectual?
Not really. I mean, it's not. I don't sort of self-identify as a public intellectual, but it's okay.
Okay, great. So to start with, David, if you could just break down some of the mechanisms that were used against you in pushing you and dislodging you out of Bristol University, just to give the audience a quick background on what happened to you. And then also, if you could break down for us similar kind of campaigns that have been pointed in the United States at academics there, just as a quick introduction.
Well, I mean, the Zionist movement, which is a worldwide body with thousands of different organizations, charities, and companies all around the world, organizes and coordinates its activities. And one of the things they've been doing in the last few years in France and in Germany and the US and in the UK and other places too is to attack all those who stand up for Palestinian rights and try and smear them as being anti-Semites. Now that's difficult for them, but they managed to do it from two separate parts of a strategy. The first part of the strategy, which they've been adopting since the year 2000, is to redefine what anti-Semitism means, such that it means anti-Zionism, and that, according to them, government ministers, etc., anti-Zionism is the chief form of anti-Semitism in the world today. And once you've defined anti-Semitism as being those who say, actually, settler colonialism must end, we must end the occupation, those are things which are regarded by them as being an all-out assault on Jewish self-determination, as they would call it, i.e. the right for them to go and steal the land and expel the Palestinians, which is what they refer to as Jewish self-determination. And in addition to that weapon which they fashioned, which is to distort and redefine anti-Semitism, they have created a whole range of organizations which are more or less at arm's length, or more or less at arm's length, which are dedicated to raising the cost to anyone, any organization, any individual who might stand up for Palestinian rights. So in the UK, for example, from 2014 especially, they created a whole range of new pro-Israel groups, around 100 new pro-Israel groups, on top of the several hundreds of Zionist groups which already existed, to take on and attack advocates for Palestinian rights. So the campaign against anti-Semitism, UK Lawyers for Israel, Labour Against Anti-Semitism, the troll handle on Twitter, Nasser Jew, tons of these organizations set up, the Sussex Friends of Israel, etc., etc. And these were all set up from around 2013-14 onwards. And they, of course, all made use of this weapon which they have, which was the redefinition of anti-Semitism. Now, in my case, that's what they did. They try and claim that when I had talked about the specific Zionist component of Islamophobia, which I said was pushed forward by certain parts of the Zionist movement, they said that what I meant was the Jews. That it was really the Jews I was saying who were pushing forward Islamophobia. Now, of course, I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. I was referring to specific organizations which identify as Zionist and which were pushing anti-Muslim ideas, which was a matter of fact had come out of my research. But what they did with them was they tried to use those allegations, and they used the allegations. There was an investigation for 18 months, and then I was found not guilty of everything. And then 6 weeks later, I was in a public meeting where I referred to the fact that I'd been attacked and complained about, is what the words I used. And they then all hell then broke loose again, because I had apparently threatened students by referring to the fact that the student Zionist groups had complained about me, which of course they had. And they were able to use that, and to use the fact that the university had adopted the new definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definitions it's called, which is an Israeli government definition, to pressure the university. Funders of the university pressured the university. Quite a lot of them said that they should get rid of me, or etc. And more than 100 MPs and peers wrote to demand that I should be sacked, including, I suppose it's quite well known, including Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, shockingly. So there was a campaign waged against me to get rid of me. And of course, this is the same tactics they've used elsewhere. They've used them against people in Canada, which we've looked at recently in the show that I produced, Palestine Declassified. So Laith Marouf or Khaled Barakat, or many academics in the US. Norman Finkelstein, perhaps, is the most famous of them. Steve Salaita, who of course was drummed out of an academic job and now drives a school bus as a result. So this is not something which is just directed at me as an individual. It's directed at many, many other academics, and indeed many others, as people will know, in the Labour Party in this country, or in other organisations and councils or trade unions, or in the legal profession, or in all sorts of professions. They try and get people out of their jobs, try and have them sacked, try and close down the possibility, make people scared of speaking out on Palestine. And that's, it's quite effective in some ways, in that it does mean that a lot of people will not speak out. But the difficulty for them is that the opposition to the racist policies and the racist existence of the Zionist regime in Palestine is such that there is an overwhelming tide of opposition coming towards them, which they can't stop, and that's their difficulty.
David, can you also just clarify what exactly the IHRA has to do with the Israeli government? Because I think, unfortunately, that was used quite well in order to bash back solidarity with Palestinians. And unfortunately, not enough people connected it directly to the Israeli government.
Sure. Well, I mean, the Israeli government had a number of different forums for dealing with anti-Semitism and for beginning to redefine it in the 1980s and 1990s. And the lead agency at that time was the Mossad, the foreign intelligence agency of Israel, and it collaborated and coordinated through Israeli embassies with anti-Semitism organizations, usually Zionist organizations. In the UK, for example, the Community Security Trust, which was the ones which first complained about me, or the Anti-Defamation League in the US. And then from 2000 on, they created this thing called the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism, which from around about the middle of that decade had a series of conferences, which still go on every 2 or 3 years, where they bring together people from all over the world, including all their assets from France and Germany and Latin America and the UK and the US, to work on the whole definition of anti-Semitism. And it was that process which first led to the emergence of the new working definition of anti-Semitism, which was adopted by what was then called the European Union Monitoring Centre on Xenophobia and Racism. And that was almost the same, almost word for word, what we now have under the IHRA. But what then happened was there was a pushback against that. And the EUMC, or the Fundamental Rights Agency as it became, then dropped the definition. So they had a bit of a crisis, and they didn't know what to do about that. They planned in in Israel at the forum, the annual or biannual conferences they had, where they could reintroduce this definition. And the way in which they found to reintroduce it was through this International Holocaust Remembrance Association, which had been meeting to discuss questions of especially of Holocaust denial. And they thought, oh, what we'll do is we'll put in the anti-Semitism definition, working definition we've already got, and that will then can then be adopted by other countries and can be applied. And of course, that was tremendously successful. It was eventually adopted by the IHRA in 2016 and was, of course, used very effectively against the Corbyn-led Labour Party, has been adopted by many universities and governments and public bodies, and is used as a kind of a cudgel to beat anyone who raises the question of the intrinsic racism of the Zionist entity. And if you talk about with any kind of basis in the facts what Israel is and what it did and what it continues to do, you can't escape from questions of ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, and fundamental racism. So, and of course, the IHRA says that if you talk in that way, that's probably crossing the line into anti-Semitism, and that's the weapon they used.
So, David, you have, after this significant battle with the Israel lobby and an attempt to designate you as essentially persona non grata within not only public institutions, but pretty much within public life in this country, you've now found yourself with seemingly a new designation by a particularly suspicious organization. Can you tell us about this new designation that seems to have been placed on you?
So I discovered just the other day that my name appears along with 90 odd others on a list of people who are designated as information terrorists and who might be prosecuted as war criminals in the case of the conflict in Ukraine. And this is by an organization called the Center for Countering Disinformation. And I hadn't known about this list really until very recently. But the process was that last July they issued a list which I wasn't on, and there were so many people on it who were active in public life in the West that there was sort of pushback against this. Now, what happened was that people like Scott Ritter, for example, people in the Cato Institute, a well-known kind of libertarian right-wing organization. I think Tucker Carlson's on there from Fox News, as well as a number of leftists and others. And there was pushback because, of course, this is an organization which is funded by the State Department. So the State Department's actually funding a Ukrainian organization to blacklist and potentially set up for harm US citizens. And under the First Amendment, as I understand it, in the US, you're not allowed to do the State Department isn't allowed to do that, but it's funding this Ukrainian organization to do that. So I think that probably had some kind of role in the list being taken down. But then a couple of months later, it reappeared and it was longer, and it turns out my name was on it. And then subsequently again, it was taken down. But nevertheless, it's there as a kind of blacklisting, a call by this organization, which is directly connected to the Ukrainian government, for people to be classed as information terrorists and prosecuted for war crimes. And this is a direct threat against anyone who appears on the list. Maybe if I could say what my crime was to appear on the list, it's kind of interesting to know. When they put the list up, they have a footnote or two indicating the reasons or the things which were said by the subject, to get them on the list. And I had a look at mine. Mine was an article which I'd written halfway through the year, towards the end of last year, on British intelligence and propaganda. And in that article, I had spent 176 words. So, this is an article of, I don't know, maybe 1,600 words. It's maybe 20% of the article. 176 words where I talked about the question of disinformation in Ukraine and whether this was, these were Russian lies or whether in fact it was Ukrainian disinformation. And the examples I used were examples where it's now plainly recognized by almost everybody that these were examples of Ukrainian disinformation, such as the Snake Island disinformation, such as the Mariupol hospital disinformation, etc. So these were the clear examples of disinformation, and it's that simply writing about that in 176 words was enough to get me on this list. And I thought that was really quite striking. So I mean that's my part of the story, but of course this is a much bigger story. Do you want me to talk about how it links into other propaganda activities? Yeah.
What I wanted to ask actually is the NATO Ukraine Civic League was founded in 2003 and made up a kind of spider's web, a network of organizations across Ukraine working on the issue of astroturfing, the idea within Ukrainian society that membership of NATO is a necessity. Could you tell us how, from there to here, how that has gone, that process?
I'm not sure if I can tell you that, but I mean, what I can tell you is what I've been looking at, which is in relation to recently to Ukrainian propaganda efforts. So the thing which perhaps should be mentioned is that this Centre for Countering Disinformation, funded by the State Department and others, is quite similar to another organization which compiles lists of people and has been compiling lists of people since 2014, including thousands and thousands of journalists and people who supported the secession of the Donbass from Ukraine, etc. And more recently, since the conflict has heightened in January 2022, February 2022, there have been a number of Western commentators, including people like, obviously Scott Ritter and a number of others, but including Henry Kissinger, right? So this is quite extraordinary. And so we find that some of the people who were on the Centre for Countering Disinformation, like Scott, also then appeared on this Mairovets list, which has been referred to as a kill list. And of course, some of the supporters of Ukraine have said, "Oh, it's not a kill list; it's just public information." But of course, there have been a number of people on that list whose personal data is put up and who have ended up dead. And then what happens on that website is that they have in red letters across their faces where the word "eliminated." So you can see how it's pretty close to actually being a kill list. Now, what's said is that this is an NGO. It's a non-governmental organization. It's got no connection to the Ukrainian government, and people have tried to report on this and try to suggest that it has got some connections to the Ukrainian government. But I've discovered in doing some research on this that there's a fairly quick, straightforward way in which it's linked to the Ukrainian government, which is that the person who registered the domain name for the website with the kill lists on it registered them from an organization called Inform Napalm, which gives you a bit of a clue as to what the organization is about. It's using information as a weapon of warfare. Now, this kill list website is called Peacemaker, but Inform Napalm, it really expresses the proper way in which it thinks of its role, which is to use information as a weapon against the enemies of Ukraine. And when you look at Inform Napalm, well, that's an organization which, again, people say is an NGO, just a voluntary group of people trying to put a certain view over on the Ukraine conflict. But actually, again, this is falsehood. The person who registered the domain name for that website, a different person, is the founder of the website. And of course, they have on their LinkedIn page, handily enough, that they worked from the beginning of the creation of the website to the present day with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence. So we have a direct connection here between the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence and its various subsets, and both Inform Napalm, and indeed the Peacemaker Kill List website. So this is a formal product of the Ukrainian government, and it's effectively being supported by NATO and by the US and the UK. To have someone like Henry Kissinger on a kill list is pretty extraordinary, and you can see the same kinds of connections that there are with these organizations, with various other organizations, and in particular, what I would say, you mentioned your question at the beginning was about how to spread the idea of the importance and necessity of NATO. Well, the way in which these techniques have been developed, we already have given the example of the Centre for Counter Disinformation, which is funded by the State Department, and we have lots of examples of those kinds of organizations being funded by the West, including particularly by the State Department or the National Endowment for Democracy, which of course is well known as a CIA front. But what's also interesting, and I've been looking at recently, is the way in which NATO, through its Center of Excellence on Strategic Communications, and the US through its psychological operations and psychological warfare groups, and indeed the UK through both PSYOPs, people from the military, an organization called Military Strategic Effects, for example, but also people who are part of the intelligence apparatus in the British government, have been advising Ukrainians on strategic communications since at least 2013, i.e. even before the Maidan coup, the US-backed coup in very early 2014. There have been people there advising them, including British officials advising the Minister of Defence, embedded in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There's one guy who came back from his embedding in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there in 2018. He came back here, and he then went straight back into an organisation called the National Security Communications Team, which is itself part of the British intelligence apparatus, funded by the secret vote through the Conflict Stability Fund, Conflict and Stability Fund. And he then went straight back to work on spreading lies about the alleged Russian attack on the Skripals in Salisbury, the alleged Novichok poisoning in Salisbury in 2018. So you can see that this is not just about stuff that the Ukrainians are doing and the far right in Ukraine is doing, but it's about stuff which has been tutored to them and advised to them by the US and the UK, and indeed by NATO's Centre of Excellence on Strategic Communications, in which lots of Western propaganda experts have been involved.
Interestingly, on that subject of British involvement, we've had Tobias Elwood advocating for an escalation and really gesticulating in front of cameras every chance he gets on the subject. But never mentioned is the fact that Tobias Elwood, while being an MP, is actually a lieutenant in the 77th Brigade, a reserve lieutenant in the 77th Brigade, which is the British military's psychological warfare unit. We also know that the current Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, resigned from his job at the arms firm Kinetic the same month that he became an MP. And we also know that the company Kinetic has had £800 million worth of new orders in the past 6 months alone, following the war in Ukraine escalating. And we also know that one of the directors of this company, Kinetic, by the name of Gordon Messenger, is actually on the Defence Reform Advisory Board to Ukraine and has been since 2016. And in fact, Kinetic really blew the lid on a program that they have in direct collaboration with the Ministry of Defence to produce these suicide drones through a 3D printing technique. Now, unfortunately for Kinetic and the Ministry of Defence, when Kinetic put the information about this suicide drones project on their website and alluded to the fact that it involved 6 arms companies, swiftly it seems that Kinetic were given directives from the Ministry of Defence to take down that information, and they panicked and took down the information because nowhere else had the project been publicized. So Ukraine and the conflict there is definitely a trough that many in the British political elite are feeding off. Could you just break down for us, David, what is the 77th Brigade that MP Tobias Elwood is a part of?
Sure. Well, I mean, the Ukrainians way back in 2014 were being advised by both the US's psychological warfare units and indeed the UK's psychological warfare brigade. Now, at that stage, it was called the 15th Psychological Operations Group, and it was led by this guy called Steve Tatum, who went on to work for Strategic Communication Laboratories, the ones which became very famous for their role as the parent for Cambridge Analytica and the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Tatum, after he was at the 15th Psychological Operations Group, then went off to work for the Stratcom Centre of Excellence for NATO in Latvia, and was involved then in training the Ukrainians and also other Baltic states, including NATO members, in strategic communications, i.e. in lying and the use of lies in war. Now, of course, that's the opposite to what you hear on the media about the Cambridge Analytica story, which is about, Cambridge Analytica was helping the Russians to throw the election for Trump. But actually, of course, during all this period, Cambridge Analytica and Strategic Communications Laboratories were working hand in glove with NATO and with UK PSYOPs and US PSYOPs to support the pro-NATO activities in Ukraine and to support the government there. Now, the 15th Psychological Operations was then merged into the 77th Brigade shortly thereafter, a couple of years afterwards. And that's become a kind of a much bigger grouping than the 15th Psychological Operations was. And it's involved various other parts of the British military, including some intelligence elements, which are also in there, although some of them have been taken off more recently. So the 77th is a psychological warfare division, and it's been involved in training Ukrainians, and indeed, we know from the Integrity Initiative leaks in 2018, which was a project funded by the Foreign Office, which was supposed to counter Russian disinformation, but which ended up criticizing the leader of the opposition, that they had over Ukrainian Special Forces people to train them at the 77th Brigade's headquarters. But the 77th is an organization which is devoted to propaganda and misinformation. That's its function. And so having someone like Tobias Elwood as an MP and also working for the 77th Brigade, where he not only is he an MP and working with the 77th, he's also active as an MP on defence matters. So he's kind of commenting as an MP on defence matters, where he's also structurally a part of the Ministry of Defence, which is an extraordinary conflict of interest and shouldn't be allowed. He should have to declare his conflict of interest at every moment where he speaks on subjects of relevance, and of course that should be he should recuse himself in any committee that he's part of, like, for example, the Defence Committee. He shouldn't be allowed to speak on defence matters because he has a conflict of interest. Now, this is not an uncommon thing in the UK. We have a new MP at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who is a woman called Alicia Cairns, who herself used to be an MI6 contractor and indeed used to work in the Foreign Office in a propaganda role in relation to Syria. So this is not an uncommon thing, but it does show the way in which there is no proper political debate and accountability in the UK, because these people have conflicting roles. Of course, Alicia Cairns has been to the forefront of trying to ramp up pressure on Ukraine and indeed over Iran and various other topics. So this is how it works. You have a propaganda operation, which in itself is covert and secretive, and we don't really know anything about it. The 77th doesn't have a Twitter handle. We don't know. I mean, it's supposed to be there to manage social media, right? But we don't. It doesn't have its own Twitter handle. All that it does is covert. And of course, we know that since the advent of COVID, that it has declared that it amongst its functions is managing and manipulating UK public opinion, and that never was the case before. From the 1940s up to about 2 years ago, that was never the case. But now we have the British military openly saying that part of their role is to manage public opinion in the UK, not just on matters of foreign affairs, but on matters of domestic policy too.
And of course, Alicia Kearns, Tobias Elwood, and even widely rumored former MI6 agent Rory Stewart were all at the forefront of the felling of Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister. So that brings into question the role of these actors in terms of domestic politics also. But David, unfortunately, we are out of time today on the Watchdog. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you will join us again soon.